All right, so Jeremiah, the book, Jeremiah, here's the Hebrew name. Again, I like the Torah because the names in English were different than the names in Hebrew. Not the case. Sefer means book of, and that's Jeremiah in Hebrew. I've been throwing a key passage at you. We won't start with this. We'll get to this passage in a few minutes, but this will be key to how we're going to look at the message and some of the theme of the book of Jeremiah as it unfolds. Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. Chapter 1 is the call of Jeremiah. And here, these verses are very particular things God calls him to. But let's talk history. Jeremiah is in the southern kingdom, in the kingdom of Judah. He's at the end of the kingdom of Judah. The last 3 or 4 kings. Josiah, Jeremiah comes to be the office of prophet in the 13th year of King Josiah, which is right about the time Josiah institutes his reforms. Josiah, if you remember, becomes a king at a very young age, 7 or 8 years old. Jeremiah is called at a very young age too. And some think that Josiah and Jeremiah would be similar in age. And so the 13th year is when he kind of starts his prophetic ministry. He goes through Zedekiah, 587, 586 BC is the fall of Jerusalem. So Jeremiah is in the end, the very last part of the southern kingdom before Babylon comes in and overthrows it. I see Jeremiah 1, 2, and 3 because in those verses it lists these kings. Sorry, I didn't have that open. Let me just read that for us. The word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign of King Josiah, son of Amnon, king of Judah, and through the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, down to the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, when the people of Jerusalem went into exile. So if you want some dates, if you like that sort of thing, probably about 626 is where we are here, and 586, actually some put it about 584, because Jeremiah, he goes into exile, but he doesn't go into exile in Babylon. He is forced to go to Egypt. Actually, chapter 43, let me just go over there to show the end of his kind of life in that regard. Chapter 43, verse 4. So Jonathan, son of Kareah, and all the army officers and all the people disobeyed the Lord's command to stay in the land of Judah. So part of his prophecy was, don't ally with Egypt. Don't go to Egypt. Stay. Instead, Johanan, son of Kareah, and all the army officers led away all the remnant of Judah who had come back to live in the land of Judah from all the nations where they had been scattered. They also led away all those whom Nebuchadnezzar, commander of the imperial guard, had left with Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, and son of Shaphan, the men, the women, the children, and the king's daughters. And they took Jeremiah the prophet and Baruch, son of Neriah, along with them. So they entered Egypt in disobedience to the Lord, and they went as far as Taphanes. So that's about 584 when Jeremiah is forcibly removed. It's after Nebuchadnezzar has destroyed Jerusalem and taken away 3 waves of captives. Jeremiah is taken out, and he's not taken to Babylon, he's taken to Egypt. We'll talk a little later and see that this idea of Jeremiah, he had lots of oppositions. A couple of little fast facts. I feel like I'm doing a podcast now. Fast fact number 1. Jeremiah is the longest book in the Old Testament by number of Hebrew words. If you look at chapters wise and pages and whatnot, it might be, but by Hebrew word count, Jeremiah is the longest Old Testament book, which I thought was interesting. I didn't realize that. And last week, somebody asked about Isaiah. Is it the longest? I think I said yes. And I learned this week, no, Jeremiah by that metric is the longest book. Second little detail, Jeremiah, do you know the nickname Jeremiah had? He was called sometimes the weeping prophet. Lamentations, which he is credited with writing, which picks up the lament. We'll get to that much later in our journey through the Hebrew Bible, has that sort of sad tone to it. The weeping prophet. Jeremiah was not embraced because his message was not one that a lot of people wanted to embrace. His message was harsh. His message was about the impending destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity of the people. So let's put some things in historical perspective here, because maybe we kind of wonder where things are happening. So I looked for a lot of charts. I thought this had these nice bold colors and might be a little easier to see. You probably can't read the words though. Sorry. So here, let me explain some things to you. First of all, across the top, the Assyrian Empire gave way to the Babylonian Empire, gave way to the Medo-Persian Empire. So these are, other than Israel, these are key ancient Near Eastern empires. Last week, we were in Isaiah. If you remember, Isaiah is in the southern kingdom, just like Jeremiah, but his ministry was around the time when the northern kingdom of Israel was taken into captivity by the Assyrian Empire. So he is in this time frame. He's about 100 years or so before Jeremiah. They're both in the same place. By the way, the colors, the blue would be what we would call the major prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. The green would be minor prophets, and that they also included Ezra and Nehemiah in the minor prophet green. Just if that kind of helps you think. So Isaiah's here about 100 years before Jeremiah. Jeremiah, as you see, it straddles these two empires. When the Assyrian Empire gives way to the Babylonian Empire. There's a lot going on in Jeremiah's day. Some dates for you. 628 is approximately the time when Josiah institutes his reforms, where he realizes that Israel has strayed from God and begins to do things like tear down high places and other places of worship outside of Jerusalem, restores the temple and the book of the law and all that sort of thing. 627, a lot of scholars point to the year that Jeremiah is called. So we're right about, they're close together. It's also the year that 627, the last great Assyrian king dies. I wrote his name down, if I can remember it, if I can find it here. No, I did not write his name down, sorry. But the last great Assyrian king dies. Babylon is part of Assyria. So in 627, when he dies, there is, in the next year or so, and I did write his name down because I just saw it, Nebuchadnezzar declares himself separate, Babylon independent from the Assyrian Empire, and takes the throne of the Babylonian Empire, and thus begins the waning of the Assyrian Empire's influence and the rise of the Babylonian Empire. This is right where Jeremiah is historically. There's a lot going on. In Israel, yes, but in the greater ancient Near Eastern world. And so all of that works together to create what will be the ultimate in 586 BC, the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of the southern kingdom. So that's where Jeremiah is. He comes to power early on when Assyria is waning and Babylon is rising. And he sees Babylon, through Nebuchadnezzar, exert their influence, come in even to Judah. We looked at that, remember, last week in the passages in Isaiah that they let the Babylonian king come take a tour of the treasure houses of Jerusalem. And Isaiah said, bad move, because what they've seen, they're going to come back and get it. So Jeremiah, 100 years later, gets to be there when that happens. Okay. What is next? Okay, let's talk about, we have in Jeremiah some information about how the book of Jeremiah came to be put together, which is kind of cool. In Jeremiah 36, let's remember the chapter. I don't know if I've said this before. If I have, it bears repeating. If not, it's worth noting. Hebrew is primarily an oral language, which makes sense. The time frame we're talking about, 600 BC, education, writing, supplies are you just don't go to Barnes and Noble or go to Kinko's or Office Depot to run a bunch of copies of a manuscript. There are few people that have the education and the ability to write, and the materials upon which they would write are terribly expensive. So when we think of the book of Jeremiah, primarily the chapters 2 through 25, a lot of those oracles that come through that, these were spoken. He was going to different places, kings, different people talking about things. In chapter 36, it says, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah, so let's go back. In the 13th year of Josiah, he comes to power. In the 4th year of Jehoiakim, this happened. So 13th year would be about 27, 26. 4th year would be about 05. So we're 20-something years into his ministry, right? He's been doing this for a while. I guess I can just read off the screen. So in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, this word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Take a scroll and write on it all the words I have spoken to you concerning Israel, Judah, and all the other nations from the time I began speaking to you in the reign of Josiah till now. So we have this recorded moment when God instructs Jeremiah to write down the things of his ministry. We don't get this insight into every one of the prophets. So verse 4, that was verse 1 and 2, verse 4. So Jeremiah called Baruch. We heard about Baruch on the exile to Egypt. He was sent to because he's the scribe that writes it down, son of Neriah. And while Jeremiah dictated all the words the Lord had spoken to him, Baruch wrote them on a scroll. Kind of cool, isn't it? Now, it gets better, because I said Jeremiah was not the most popular feller, not the most popular message to give. So a little bit later in chapter 36, it was the 9th month, and the king, who's Jehoiakim, was sitting in the winter apartment with a fire burning in the fire pot in front of him. Makes sense. It's winter. He's cold. Whenever Jehudi had read 3 or 4 columns of the scroll that Baruch had prepared of the prophecies, the oracles of Jeremiah, the king cut them off with a scribe's knife and threw them in the fire pot until the entire scroll was burned in the fire. 20 verses later, right? Chapter 36, verse 1 and 2, write it down. Verse 4, he gets Baruch to do it. Verse 22 and 23, the king doesn't like what he's reading, doesn't like the message of Jeremiah. As it's read to him, he's cutting it up and throwing it in the fire. This is prophecy. This is the prophetic ministry of Jeremiah. Why is he the weeping prophet? Well, because I have a lot of work to write that scroll. We got to do it again. But hey, I'm deterred. After the king burned the scroll containing the words that Baruch had written at Jeremiah's dictation, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. Take another scroll and write on it all the words that were on the first scroll, which Jehoiakim, king of Judah, burned up. So Jeremiah took another scroll, gave it to the scribe Baruch, son of Neriah, and as Jeremiah dictated, Baruch wrote on it all the words of the scroll that Jehoiakim, king of Judah, burned in the fire, and many similar words were added to them. That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? So the second scroll is going to be more. The first scroll was one thing that gets burned, and now this says that what happens, and there's a lot of thought what this means. We're going to look in a minute at just kind of the composition of Jeremiah and how it's put together and all that. We'll see Jeremiah is unique in that if you were just to look through it, you would notice the first section through about chapter 25 is oracles. It's things that he spoke that were recorded. Now, Baruch, now maybe the question, and I guess this goes without saying, let me back up. We're 20-something years into his ministry. He had to remember all that? That's a lot. Well, why did he do it? The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. So God said, I want you to write this down. So part of what we believe about the inspiration of Scripture is that God helped bring to his mind the things that he wanted written down. Now, this could also explain, by the way, when we look at that section of oracles, why it's not chronological. You can't look at Jeremiah 2 through 25 and see, oh, he's talking about this, and he's talking about this, and he's talking about that. Some of it's organized thematically. There's this topic, and then he talks about something, and this topic comes back up. But we can't look at Jeremiah as a historical. Jeremiah 2 talks about things that happened before Jeremiah 5, talks about things that happened before Jeremiah 10. It's a jumble. The chronology is mixed up, and part of it is, again, we credit that to the inspiration of God, that he helped Jeremiah recall the words in the way that he wanted, so that the document we have, we don't look at this and go, oh, forget about it, it's not authoritative. No, we actually see we might say the honesty, the authenticity of the process that we're told went into it, and the opposition that often came to Jeremiah and other prophets of his day. But particularly, if you're Jehoiakim, what's happening? Babylon's rising, you're about to lose everything, and you got this prophet over here saying it's going to be bad. What do you want him to do? You want him to shut up. You want him to go away and leave you alone, right? Just that simple. And so that was his way of shutting him up. There are lots of other ways that he was also shut up. We'll get to that. Jeremiah, not an easy life. Okay, so here's kind of an overview, outline, call it what you want. I've already said chapter 1 is the call of Jeremiah. And we'll look at that key verse in a few minutes and thematically how that holds it in. And then chapters 2 through 25 are the oracles of Jeremiah. These are primarily targeted to Israel or Judah, to the people of God, calling out their unfaithfulness to the covenant, the things they've done wrong, and the reasons why then God was going to bring punishment upon them. So this section, this oracle section, it is largely negative, largely about the judgment that's coming, and not something that anybody really want to hear. And then there's this break. You can actually see it in the way the text itself is laid out. If you were to look at the first 20 or so chapters, there's a lot of poetic sections that are there, these oracles, because they're spoken. Certainly that would be a way that would help make them memorable. Then we get to chapter 26. And we see that while there is some, this section moves to a different kind. It's almost historical. It's like, let me tell you a little bit about Jeremiah. One thing that we might see is in chapters 2 through 25, a lot of that is first person from Jeremiah's voice. And some of these other biographical, what I call biographical interludes, are not from Jeremiah, they're about Jeremiah. There's places where it's third person instead of first person pronoun in that. And so we have one of these, some things that happened to Jeremiah there. And then a very important section of the book of Jeremiah, 30, 31, 32 and 33 a little bit, but mostly 30, 31. It's often called the little book of comfort. It's this section in Jeremiah in the midst of lots of horrible things happening in history to Judah, Babylon beginning to assert their influence, and these oracles of judgment coming. Jeremiah has these chapters that bring just a glimmer of hope to the people of Israel. And then we have another section, 30, a rather large section of more sort of biographical information, stories about Jeremiah, things that happened to him in encounters that he does, followed by another section of oracles, these specifically not against Israel, but against the nations. We saw this in Isaiah, if you remember last time. The prophets come and they speak words of judgment, warning, destruction to the people of God. And the natural thought would come to anybody's mind, why are we being punished by these other nations who are worse than us? Well, in many of these prophetic books, it's not just oracles against Israel. There are things that are said against the nations, Babylon, Aram, Edom, all the ones around them, Philistia and the like, showing that God hasn't ignored their evil, But he's going to be just as fair with them, though he might use them to punish Israel. They aren't getting off scot-free. And then chapter 52 is actually an interesting chapter. I don't want to say it's repeated because it's not, but it's in many ways a retelling with some almost word-for-word quotes of the last chapter of 2 Kings 25. It's about the fall of Jerusalem. Jeremiah ends the same way 2 Kings ends. Again, it's not word-for-word quote, but some of it does very much quote some of the verses in 2 Kings 25, including the way that it ends on that hopeful note. If you remember when we look at 2 Kings, we said Kings ends the sort of historical, from creation to exile story of the people of God. 2 Kings ends that story. And it ends with people in exile. But the last few verses show the line of David, the king that was in prison in Babylon, being elevated, invited to a new king comes into the Babylon. He releases the king from prison, puts him at his table and gives him specific rations. And the rest of his days, he dines at the king of Babylon's table. That story ends both 2 Kings and Jeremiah. It is an important note of hope in what are otherwise very depressing and destructive and judgmental stories of what God is doing. It says that God is, in fact, not finished with his people. He hasn't forgotten the promise he made to David that one on his line would be on the throne forever. And so that's how it ends. It's a unique ending because I don't want to say it's lifted word for word, but it's pretty much, you can read the two and say, yeah, it's the same story. Jerusalem falls and Jehoiakim is released. So a different kind of ending there. So that's sort of the big overview of Jeremiah. Now let's talk thematically. Let's look at some things a little bit differently. I said the theme verse or the key passage was in Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. This is in the call of Jeremiah to be the prophet. Verse 9, then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth. Does that sound like Isaiah, right? The call touched my mouth and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. So this is what God is calling Jeremiah to do. Notice, over nations and kingdoms. So not just Israel, although much of his ministry is directed at Israel and the exile that will come, the larger point of his ministry is the whole world because God's sovereign over everything, not just Israel. And then notice these pairs, the three pairs of ideas. To uproot and tear down, positive or negative? Negative. Destroy and overthrow, positive or negative? Negative. Build up and plant. Hey! Twice as much negative, 4 negatives, 2 positive. But those positives are pretty important, right? Because a lot of that 2 through 25 is uproot and tear down, destroy and overthrow. That the people of Israel have broken the covenant and God's going to punish them. In fact, just to give you kind of a little taste of that, chapter 2 of Jeremiah, after his call, he starts chapter 2 with this uproot, tear down, destroy, and overthrow idea. Where's my page? Together. The word of the Lord came to me. Go and proclaim in the hearing of Jerusalem. This is what the Lord says. I remember the devotion of your youth. How as a bride you loved me and followed me through the wilderness, through a land not sown. Israel was holy to the Lord, the first fruits of his harvest. All who devoured her were held guilty as disaster overtook them. That's good, right? Isaiah had the same idea in chapter 5, the vine, special vine that God had planted. and cared for and nourished, and it grew and flourished. But hear the word of the Lord, you descendants of Jacob, all you clans of Israel. This is what the Lord said. What fault did your ancestors find in me that they strayed so far from me? They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. They did not ask, where is the Lord who brought us out of Egypt and led us through the barren wilderness, through a land of deserts and ravines, a land of drought and darkness, a land where no one travels and no one lives? The idea is Israel forgot the Lord. And then a little bit later, verse 10, I'll just jump ahead rather than read it all. Chapter 2, verse 10, yes. Cross over the coast of Cyprus and look. Send to Kedar and observe closely. See if there's been ever anything like this. Has a nation ever changed its gods? Yet they are no gods at all. But my people have exchanged their glorious God for worthless idols. Be appalled at this, you heavens, and shudder with great horror, declares the Lord. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. This is the indictment that God has against the people of Israel. That means they will be uprooted and torn down, destroyed and overthrown. This is not God acting capriciously. This is not some moment of I don't know what you would call it, some predetermined idea that God had for him, but it's God's response to the actions of the people of Israel turning from him. And I think in there, we also see, just like we did again in Isaiah 5, that vine chapter, the personal, relational, even love of God for this people, Israel. These indictments, it's like he's got a broken heart over what's happened. He can't believe, even the other nations whose gods are no gods at all, they still keep worshiping them and doing all this stuff. But my people and think about, that history that we looked at from Exodus on, all that God did for them through Joshua and the occupation of the land and all, the monarchy and the growth. My people exchanged the one true God for false gods. And instead of a cistern or spring of living water, went into cisterns that do not hold water. So God is responding. This call, this commission to Jeremiah isn't anything less than God. Again, back to Deuteronomy, was it Deuteronomy 28? Blessings and cursings. Blessings, cursings. They haven't kept their side of the deal. And God is being faithful to his word, to his promise. He's not angry. He's not capricious. He's not vengeful. He's just saying, I told you up front, be faithful to me and I will bless you. Turn from me and I won't. And you've turned from me. And so we see in this that idea. And so a lot of what we get in Jeremiah is this kind of imagery, this uprooting, this tearing down, this destroying, this overthrowing, images like prostitution or harlotry that stand in for their idolatry and all sorts of things that he would come at them and accuse them of that causes this to happen. But here's the wonderful note of hope. We'll see this in all of the prophetic work, even the harsh things that are said. God always has this. God is faithful to keep his promise. And the promise that drives this part of the story of Israel is the covenant to David. And I think it's 2 Samuel 7, where we talked about that a few books ago, to build and to plant. In fact, we see this idea show up in Jeremiah, even in the midst of this. Just a few places to point out. We just read 110, that theme verse, but if we go to chapter 18, verse 9, actually, let me start at verse 7 and 8, because it kind of gives the full thing. If at any time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be uprooted, torn down, or destroyed, those are words right out of there, right? And if that nation I warn repents of its evil, then I will relent and not inflict on it the disaster I had planned. And if at another time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be built up and planted, so we have these ideas repeated throughout Jeremiah. If it does evil in my sight, then I will reconsider the good I intended. So So this idea is there. It's the character of God, it's the promise of God, it's the nature of God, it's the covenant God has made as part of it. Chapter 24, a couple pages over, verse 6, similar thoughts. My eyes will watch over them for their good, God promises, and I will bring them back to this land, and I will bring them up and not, I will build them up and not tear them down. I will plant them and not uproot them. There we go. God's, even in the midst of judgment, promising this. Chapter 42, we'll go a little bit further. Verse 10. If you stay in this land, I will build you up and not tear you down. I will plant you and not uproot you, for I have relented concerning the disaster I have inflicted upon you. So we have these notes of hope throughout. And this is interesting because it's not just Jeremiah that we see this. If we were to go back, sort of, where do we hear this kind of language before Jeremiah? We can go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, where the prophet Nathan confronts David. Bet you'll never guess what he tells him. It's the covenant, the promise to David, actually, not the confrontation. I'm sorry, I misspoke there. Chapter 7, verse 10. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares this to you himself. He will establish a house for you when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors. I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He will be the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Some translations, instead of establish, they have used the word plant. So we have this idea, build up. And what's it building up here? What's he building up? Right? It's the Davidic line, that promise. Then we get past Jeremiah, and we say, do we see this language anywhere else? So if we go over to Amos, one of the minor prophets, chapter 9, verses, beginning in verse 11, Amos says this, in that day, it's the very end of Amos, I will restore David's fallen shelter. I will repair its broken walls and restore its ruins. I will rebuild it as it used to be, so that they may possess the remnant of Eden and all the nations that bear my name, declares the Lord who will do these things. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when the reaper will be overtaken by the plowman and the planter by the one treading grapes. New wine will drip from the mountains and flow from the hills, and I will bring back my people Israel from exile. They will rebuild the cities. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine. They will make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I have given them. So this call to Jeremiah, the uproot, tear down, destroy, and overthrow, but particularly build and plant, is a theme that kind of reaches back to what? David's covenant promise, and reaches forward to the ultimate restoration after the uprooting and tearing down, destroying and overthrow, as if what God is wanting to say through Jeremiah and to his people is he never tears down or destroys or overthrows as an end in itself. It's only so that he can prepare for something better and what would be his blessing ultimately to come. I know some of you, anybody ever remodel a house? Mm-hmm. Yes. When you remodel, do you say, I'm just going to build right on top of the old rotty wood, plumbing structures, whatever? No, right? What do? You tear it all down. Sometimes you go to the studs. You dig out the pipes from the floor. If you want to
make everything different.
You change it completely.
Back the way it was.
But before you can build and plant, you got to uproot and tear down. You got to get rid of the problematic stuff so that it won't infect and cause problems and so this is the idea behind this, not just in Jeremiah, but the promise to David, and ultimately, even as we see later in Amos and other of the minor prophets, the restoration that will come, the rebuilding and the planting. So this theme that is the call of Jeremiah is pretty important in the history of Israel and what God will do. I don't know what my next slide is. Okay, here we go. One of my favorite parts of Jeremiah is he's quite the dramatic guy. I just listed some. There are actually more. There are lots of places. This isn't just a Jeremiah thing, but he seems to have, and we'll see it in Ezekiel next week. He seems to have a lot of fun with it. These symbolic acts that carry weight behind the message. You know, it's kind of like, what do you call them when Denise does it with kids? Object lessons. That's what it is. You know, sometimes when you have kids' church, or, you know, I used to do kids' sermons in church, you'd bring something up and you'd say, what is this? Oh, this is this. Well, this reminds me of something else. And Jeremiah, we've got all of these episodes in his book that are meant in that way. The linen waistband, chapter 13. I'm not going to, I mean, I could. Some of them we'll spend a little more time with than others. Linen waistband, basically gets this linen waistband. He's wearing it around his waist. He's told to go bury it, leave it there for a while, and then come dig it up. What does it look like after you bury it and dig it up? It's not good, right? And so this is what the Lord says. In the same way as the waistband that was nice became trashed, I will ruin the pride of Judah and the great pride of Jerusalem. It's a symbol of what God's going to do. The Israel thought they were somebody great and wonderful, and God's the apple of his eyes, as it were, realizes that they can't take that for granted. And that waistband was there. Chapter 18 and 19, or chapter 18, the potter's house. This is something Jeremiah sees. Very powerful section where he's told to go to the potter's house, and he sees the potter forming the pot, and Jeremiah sees it. This is the word of the Lord. Can I not do with you, Israel, as the potter does? Like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand, Israel. If at any time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be uprooted, torn down, and destroyed. And we read that a few minutes ago, this idea of the potter's house, that he sees him making the pot. And it's ultimately up to the potter, whether you bring it to completion so it's done, or whether you say there's a flaw and you just crush it. He uses that example. Chapter 19, he has this clay jug. It's interesting, clay jar. And he has it, and later in verse 10, he breaks the clay jar while those are watching and say to them, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I will smash this nation and this city. It's like Hulk smash this nation and this city, just as the potter's jar is smashed and cannot be repaired. They will bury their dead. So he uses these examples. And then chapter 27 and 28 is pretty fascinating when he puts a yoke on. He straps a yoke on as a symbol that Babylon is going to be the yoke that comes on Israel. And he walks around with it. And that's a pretty powerful symbol. You see this prophet wandering around town with this thing on. Now, interestingly enough, I said Jeremiah has lots of opposition. Chapter 28 is one of those places. Jeremiah is not the only prophet in Israel that claims to speak for Yahweh, for God. In this case, we meet Hananiah, who directly confronts Jeremiah and says, that's not going to happen. Hananiah is one. His message is peace, prosperity. Is there somebody here? Maybe. Okay.
It's Danny's son.
Okay, cool. I was like, I hear something, don't
His
I?
wife.
Either that or I'm going crazy. And so Hananiah is a prophet that supposedly speaks for God, but speaks the exact opposite message. Jeremiah is saying there's going to be a yoke, and Hananiah comes and he breaks the yoke off Jeremiah and says, no, that's not how it's going to be. And who do you think is the more popular one, by the way? Hananiah is much more popular. And we'll see in the minor prophets, there's a couple of prophets that deal with false prophets, that the true prophet of God that doesn't have a happy message, we're just going to ignore him, and we're going to listen to the guy that says everything's going to be all right. And so this is an interesting section. The last part, he's right at the time of the overthrow of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. He's told to purchase a field. That would not be a good time to buy something, right? I mean, this is definitely not going to be a long-lasting thing, and it becomes a symbol to the people. There's other things like this. I think they're kind of fascinating to look at. Jeremiah uses a variety. Oh, that's the last slide. Look at that. That doesn't mean we're done though, so don't get excited. Jeremiah uses a variety of ways to communicate his message to the people. And so we see some of those there. A couple of other kind of thoughts about Jeremiah. I want to pick up on the fact that as the weeping prophet, Jeremiah is he's opposed regularly. We just looked at Hananiah as a false prophet and that sort of thing. Hope I didn't make her mad by saying something to Katie. Just leave. My bad. But in chapter 11, we see from his own hometown, he's not a popular guy. Chapter 11, verse 21. Therefore, this is what the Lord says about the people of Anathoth. That's where Jeremiah is from, who are threatening to kill you. How about that? A prophet's not welcome in his hometown. You read that in the New Testament. They're threatening to kill him because now there's speculation that this is related to the fact that Josiah has enacted his reforms, and perhaps Jeremiah is from a priestly family, and they may have had the side gig, a side hustle, as we say today, on one of those high places, another kind of temple or religious place. And when Josiah comes in and gets rid of those, they're out of a few bucks and they're not happy, and they blame Jeremiah because he's on Josiah's side and they want to kill him. His own family is doing that. It's pretty crazy that would be the case. Chapter 12, verse 6, they go on. Your relatives, member of your own family, even they have betrayed you. They have raised a loud cry against you. Do not trust them, though they speak well of you. So his own family turns against him. There's other prophets, as we said, chapter 26. Just going to read this. This is not Hananiah specifically. Chapter 26, verses 1 through 9. We learn that again, Jeremiah is threatened with death. The priest, verse 7, the prophets and all the people heard Jeremiah speak these words in the house of the Lord. But as soon as Jeremiah finished telling all the people everything the Lord had commanded him to say, the priests, the prophets, and the people seized him and said, "You must die." He's got a happy life, doesn't he? Why is he the weeping prophet? Because every time he turns around, somebody's trying to kill him. And then chapter 38, another place where he's thrown into a cistern. Verse 6, so they took Jeremiah and put him into the cistern of Malchijah, the king's son, which was in the courtyard of the guard. They lowered Jeremiah by ropes into the cistern. It had no water in it, only mud, and Jeremiah sank down in the mud. Well, this is not a happy thing, right? I bet that smelled lovely. By Susan's face, she thinks it stunk too. So, I mean, this is his ministry. This is what he's constantly facing. Why? Because of his message. It's not a popular message. It's not a message anybody wanted to hear. And again, those false prophets that would contradict Jeremiah and say, no, we're gonna beat. A lot of their message was, we're gonna go to Egypt, which is why Jeremiah gets carried away there. We looked at that earlier. We're gonna go to Egypt as an ally against Babylon. And these prophets said that's the right way to go. Jeremiah says, no, give up. Let Babylon take over. There's no use resisting them. That's not exactly what he says, but that's the message. The other prophets say, don't listen to him. He's wrong. He's a liar. And so there's this conflict that's there, even to the point where he gets taken and taken away. And because of that, we see even times we get these glimpses. The other weeping prophet reality of Jeremiah is he prays to God. And he says, God, why are you allowing these false prophets to do this when you know I'm speaking for you? Do something about it. Get rid of them. Show the people that I'm right. Of course, that's not, it does eventually show that Jeremiah prophesied rightly, but it's not something that ever God specifically would undo.
And he was very obedient. Jeremiah was very obedient.
Yes, he was.
Even through everything, he just kept doing.
Which is pretty remarkable.
Yes.
Because again, we've seen his life was not easy.
Right.
If he had plenty of reasons to say, I don't want to do this anymore, God, find another person. But he persevered and obviously led to some things. Last thing I have a lot more, but last thing I want to mention tonight. Jeremiah shows up elsewhere in the Old Testament, which tells us even though we're on that timeline, if we go back where we are, he's at a point, there it is. Here, it's got a lot of prophets that will prophesy before him, but some things that come after. One place we see it is in, where is he? Daniel. Daniel specifically is reading Jeremiah. So that's remarkable, right? There isn't much of an overlap time-wise between Jeremiah and Daniel. Jeremiah, toward the end of his ministry, is when the Babylonian Empire comes in and takes the exiles, and Daniel's one of those taken, I think the first wave we typically think of exiles to Babylon, which was before 586. He's taken, so they're somewhat contemporaries. Daniel's probably younger, or is younger than Jeremiah, but already Daniel in Babylon has a copy of Jeremiah. That's pretty remarkable. And I say this for a lot of reasons. One, the thing that to me is significant, and it shows that early on, after Jeremiah had prophesied, even though we've looked at opposition, even though we've looked at other prophets saying a different message, there was an understanding he spoke for God. These were the words of the Lord that he proclaimed. And so they took, Daniel particularly takes it to heart. He looks at that 70 years, Daniel chapter 9, which is out of Jeremiah 29, is the place where we see that. Let me just turn there. Jeremiah 29. This is what the Lord says, verse 10. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. And then Jeremiah 29:11 is next. Did you know it was this context, by the way? I bet a lot of us know Jeremiah 29:11 and 12. But this is the 70 years that Daniel reads that he's going to liberate Israel from Babylonian captivity. He says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. That's the context of that verse that we often use in different places is this. But ultimately, I want to point out that now it's also in 2 Chronicles, chapter 36. We also hear a little bit of Jeremiah. If you remember, 2 Chronicles is the very last book of the Hebrew Bible. We talked about that a long time ago, but in the English order, it's way before Jeremiah. It's right after Kings. 2 Chronicles 36, the last few verses. And the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm. So Chronicles, which is written later, we know that because it covers later history than Jeremiah, all the way up here to the decree of Cyrus. It's the summary of creation to the return from exile. That's why in the Hebrew Bible it's the last book. But by this point, it's recognized. And I think it also points that Jeremiah says it. Daniel is probably recognized as authoritative at this point as well. And so the chronicler wants to include that point that both of them make. And I think that's significant to see how Jeremiah, as a prophet, even among his contemporaries, is ultimately recognized as authoritative. And so that should give us confidence. When we open the book and read it, it's got something to say to us from God himself. So those are all my thoughts, at least the ones I'm going to go over tonight on Jeremiah. Thoughts, comments, questions from you guys?
I think, as any of us, all of us as Christians, we can relate to Jeremiah because when we've tried to maybe live for Christ in our families, we've met opposition. Sure. And I think, it's a compliment. We're not being mean about it, not being disgusting about it, but when people see that difference, but it's not even.
As it was definitely not for him.
Or else.
Yes. To be faithful to God at times will bring opposition. I could make the modern day equivalent that I know people that can fill stadiums with a happy, happy, joy, joy, God loves the message, and people that you've never heard of that are faithfully opening the scriptures and proclaiming the hard word, the hard sayings that will never fill a stadium because we'd rather hear that message and buy that book than deal with that. Human nature hasn't changed that much.
And then all.
It's way back.
Would you take me back to chapter 13, the screen?
Where was that?
The linen waistband.
This one?
Before,
No. This one? There it is. Chapter 13.
the wording, Lord, speak to him to say, I put word in your mouth, that page,
Oh, that's his call.
before chapter 13. There,
Touched his mouth.
yeah.
Chapter 1.
Oh, no. Next page you went to chapter 13. That's why I'm referring this page.
Is this what you wanted though? This one?
Yeah, that's what I want.
Gotcha.
I don't know. Half the thing I really don't understand very much, but makes me thinking when you explain to appoint you over nation and kingdom to uproot and tear down and destroy. Is it only, that's a period of time of between 605 to 722 BC, right?
Jeremiah was
Uh-huh.
626 to 584 were his dates.
Oh, it's between 699, to, I don't know, maybe I'm misunderstanding a lot of things. I'm just
Jeremiah
saying,
should be a little bit further down.
oh, yeah.
He's, when I made this one, so that's my era.
Okay, so I wrote it down. The question is, it's not the, question is when Lord was said to him, do that, tear down and destroy. Is that at the time means upcoming future is going to be like that,
Yeah,
right?
what's going to happen in his lifetime is Israel is going to be conquered. Jerusalem is going to be, and the temple are going to be destroyed by Babylon. In his lifetime, Jerusalem is going to be conquered and the temple destroyed by Babylon. So definitely tearing down and destroying and overthrowing.
I think her question is all that. It says, I appoint you, meaning Jeremiah, to overthrow over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and tear down.
Yeah.
So he's supposed to do it. And she's saying he
Right.
really didn't do it. He just
Right.
prophesied.
He was the mouthpiece.
He was, God did it.
Okay.
God ultimately is the cause behind this. Jeremiah is just the spokesperson to bring the message of these things. Not, he wasn't involved in the war, the actual activity.
Yeah, so that whole meaning is, to me, I could be misunderstanding. I don't know. That's why which means a continuation of until exile. Is that true or not?
Yeah.
In the Bible, factor.
I don't understand exactly what you're saying, but what I think is happening is he's been appointed not to do this, but to bring the promise or the curse or blessing of God for any of these things. And yes, he saw exile happen.
Mm-hmm.
It happened in his lifetime. He didn't go to Babylon. He went to Egypt by some of the people that didn't like him. But yeah, his message was this, even though he didn't actually do these things.
But I don't know. I could be misunderstanding, but seems like the condition of those periods is just carry on continuously.
Even to today.
Yeah, that's my thought came. Am I right or wrong?
Well, the promise that ultimately we look at, that we talked about, we looked at build up and plant, was not about the nation of Israel solely or singularly. It was about the one from the line of David who would ultimately be on the throne, which we believe is a messianic promise of Jesus. So this building and planting wasn't, when we see that, Israel never really regained its glory from this point on. It came back. They returned from exile. They tried to rebuild the temple and the wall, but they never returned to the height of David's kingdom or Solomon's kingdom. And even today, while they're a country, they're not the world power they were. They're important in the world. God is still working in Israel, but ultimately, he wanted to bring about the Messiah, who is the one who fulfills the promise that was made to David, that one would be on his throne forever. And so that's ultimately what it's about, less so about the prominence of the nation Israel.
Yeah, it's kind of I go beyond a little bit more, but sure, they just I think of big as that.
Yeah. Let me read this.
It's hard
I'm
to
going to go to
understand.
that little book of comfort, chapter 31, because it talks about it as well. 31:28. This is a new covenant. That little book of comfort talks about a new covenant, not written on tablets of stone, written on our hearts. So it goes from this tangible, political, physical kingdom to, we might say, a spiritual kingdom headed by Messiah. Let me get there. Jeremiah 31, what did I say? Verse 28. The days are coming, verse 27, declares the Lord, when I will plant the kingdoms of Israel and Judah with the offspring of people and animals, just as I watched over them to uproot and tear down, and so overthrow, destroy, and bring disaster, so I will watch over them to build and to plant. And this section is that ultimate promise of the new covenant. The old covenant in Deuteronomy, we might say that was written on tablets of stone that was built there, is going to change. And we'll see that also in Ezekiel next week. This idea of a new covenant will be very important. But that's not about the nation of Israel solely. It's about the kingdom of the Messiah, which includes Israel, but also expands to the whole world. And so that was, I think, part of Israel's own struggle, is seeing that, it's not only about them, but it was always God's design for more, for bigger.
Yeah, that's what
All right. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for following along once again. Ezekiel next week. What's your homework? I get tired of saying that, but that's it. All right. Thanks, Zoom folks. Online.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your week. Hopefully we'll see you Sunday, right?
Amen.
Amen.